Stephen, good to see you. All right, so it is 5 after the hour, and so we're gonna get started. I know there was a few more people that started the second largest coral reef in the world. Right on. I'm guessing the number one is the one in Australia, Great Barrier Reef. So that's actually, I love diving, so that's a good reason for me to check out Honduras as a destination. Thank you for the fun fact. But jumping back to it, so it is 5 after the hour. And so let's get started. I know there's a few more people that had RSVP'd, but as they pop in, hopefully they can ask any questions and we can catch them up. But just want to say first off, thank you so much for taking the time to join. I'm really excited to present to you this webinar and talk a little bit more about 8base and how it can help your development efforts or your agency if that's the capacity that you're working within. A little bit about myself. My name is Sebastian. I'm the product manager here at 8base. And I really kind of head up all the developer content, and educational resources here. And so in the spirit of that, we believe that this webinar is going to be a great way to help get more and more people kind of familiar with 8base, do a walk through the platform and understand the different ways that can help them in the projects they're working on. So let me go ahead and start my screen share and we can kick things off from there. So just for everyone from a high level, so 8base is a backend-as-a-service, right? So essentially what we're saying is everything from the API backwards is a concern that we're really looking to how can we help people more efficiently accomplish their application projects, right? So whether or not you're building a front-end application that's mobile, smartwatch, web-based, whatever, having a backend infrastructure that's reliable, scalable, maintainable, as well as really quick and efficient to build is really the way that we're trying to come in and help people. Now in 8base, right, you go to 8base.com, you log in, it's a web console, and we kind of think of the core resource, the top level resource as a workspace, right? So what is a workspace? A workspace is essentially a project. It has its own dedicated database, its own API endpoint. And whenever you're kicking off a project, we encourage you to go create a workspace for that. And creating a workspace is super simple and straightforward. So you give your project a name or your workspace a name, you select the hosting region that you want that hosted in. There's a few different plans that you select for that workspace, which is essentially the monthly subscription that you pay for that infrastructure, and you create the workspace. Now, when you go and create a workspace, what's really great about that is it's essentially creating a 3-tier serverless architecture on AWS. So API gateway for provisioning your endpoint and other endpoints that might be there for webhooks in your application. AWS Lambda, which is going to be your serverless runtime. Lambda is where the GraphQL engine that 8base developed lives. And so when it's interpreting those incoming requests, that's where the SQL is generated. And then we provision you an Aurora MySQL database, which is your database layer, right? So it's built on top of a really solid MySQL database, which is Aurora. And around that 3-tier serverless architecture, there's some auxiliary services. For example, S3 for all your file and image storage. And we handle authentication using JWTs. We will plug in Cognito if you want to use Cognito for your authentication, or you can bring in a third-party auth provider that's OpenID compliant. However, we'll jump more into that stuff as we go through the demo. So if I were to click create in 10, 15 seconds, it would create that entire backend for me, and I'd have a blank project to jump into and start configuring. However, I'm going to jump into this Schemas backend workspace for the sake of example. However, for me to create this workspace, it probably took me 30 minutes, an hour to just kind of configure it and have this whole backend configured and ready to use. But we'll be able to demonstrate all the concepts that are important by just walking through this one. So when we jump into the workspace, right, this is a simple dashboard. However, even though we have a lot of examples of people using 8base in every type of application that they might be building, we tend to think about the core of an 8base workspace being the data model. So what is the data model? If I go to my data tab here, essentially, I have the ability to create a relational data model that will reverse engineer a lot of the resources that I need to then enable my application. Once again, we'll look at what that reverse engineering means. But however, at this point, what's important to notice is that I can add tables to my database, build relationships between those tables, as well as add any type of field types that I need on those tables in a very straightforward manner. So for example, let's say I wanted to add a table, click add table, and then I'm just going to say that this is called my example table, right? Now, if I wanted to add a field to this table, I could say I have a example field for which I could select any data type that this field should contain. For example, text fields, number fields, date fields, switches, which are essentially Boolean or enumeration fields, files, if I'm uploading images or documents, as well as multiple of them, tables, which is relationships, and I'll show that in a second, smart, which are essentially JSON objects with some validations, for example, addresses or phone numbers, as well as JSON. If I just want to store arbitrary JSON blobs in my database, I do that as well as geo, which are super cool. So for example, if I'm storing latitude, longitude coordinates on a field, then when using my API, I can do queries that filter by distance, that do distance calculations, proximity, any type of GeoJSON logic is already pre-built into the API. So for example, let's say I was building an application that had a map interface and wanted to show locations nearby a user, I can just use the API to query all the records that are within a certain proximity to me. So really great kind of rich features there. So if I said this is a text field, so whether it's a markdown field or whatever it might be, create it, goes ahead and creates that field. Now, what's important to note here is that while we're going through and creating tables, adding fields, the system or APBase is actually generating all of the database migrations and executing them against the database. So this is not like some spreadsheet that we're just shoving data into. This is not some type of NoSQL database that we're just throwing records in and not really caring about the structure. There's a lot of integrity here, and it's actually performing all the work that I would hire or have a database administrator have to perform. Now, for example, let's say that I wanted to build a relationship between these two tables. I'm going to take a table from our existing data model, which I'll walk through in a minute. I could just say, hey, well, there's a relationship between my example table and my posts table. I drag and drop that there. And then now I can configure that relationship to where, is it a many-to-many relationship? Is it a many-to-one relationship in either direction? Is it a one-to-one relationship? And of course, if I were to make one of these mandatory, is it a belongs to relationship, right? And on any of those, of course, I could name the relationship in either way. So for example, a post may have many examples, or an example might have many articles. However, I want that name to be named on my API, right? And then of course, if I create that relationship, that builds that, and now that's part of my data model. So I'm gonna really quickly try to see if Zoom go and if there's any questions in the group. 1 second. There we go, it's up here. So Q&A, no participants. Okay, no, because I don't think there's any questions yet. So cool. So now there's some more advanced stuff, of course. So if on this table I want to go in and add indexes to my table, I could. For example, maybe I wanted to create a view of my data. I could create a view using SQL, create a SQL view, which would generate a read-only table in my data model from which I could aggregate data from multiple tables. And what's really important to note here is that, you know, APBase has customers that has one table in a workspace, and maybe they have some type of web crawler that's just shoving data into that workspace. We also have customers that have 400 tables in their database, all with relationships interlinked, self-referential, really complicated data models. And they're able to accomplish those using this tool, which is really impressive and exciting for us. You know, and so really this tool can be pushed to accommodate project domains of significant complexity and be very performant while doing so. So don't think that this is limiting in any way to what you can accomplish. So I'm gonna go ahead and just delete that table that we just created to keep everything clean. And now if we look at the data model that we currently had in this workspace, which is the CMS backend workspace, we have a simple CMS backend, right? So we have a table called posts. And whenever we create a table, it's automatically creating a UUID for us, right? So a global ID. It's managing the create at timestamp, the updated at timestamp, as well as the created by relationship, so that any authenticated user, when they create a record, it is actually saving a relationship to the user, right? So you always know who created records in your database. So for example, we have posts in our database, which have a title, a body, a cover image, a status. It has an author relationship, has many comments, and belongs to a publication. We have publications, which have many contributors. They have many posts, and then people subscribe to the publication. And then we have publication subscriptions, as well as comments on those posts. So simple data model that could enable something like a medium type application, let's say, in that way. And now if we jump in, we can look at this data viewer, right? So this is just a nice kind of admin interface that says, hey, the records in my database, can I jump in here, filter through my data, edit a record if I wanted to. So for example, change the relationships, update the fields. This is a markdown type text field, right? So we just drop the editor in here for you so you could edit your markdown. However, what's really important about this is that, while we're going through and editing that data model, adding the tables, changing the fields, building the relationships, 8base is reverse engineering our entire GraphQL API for us, right? And this is one of the most profound time savers of how 8base can accelerate a development project or a development effort. What does that mean? Here we're going to go to our API Explorer, and this is a GraphQL API. So for those who aren't familiar with GraphQL, GraphQL is an API specification that gives you a query language which you can author on your client-side applications that get interpreted on the back end and respond with the data that you want. So in another way, it's almost like giving you a query language that the front end can use to query data, rather than more traditionally to where you hit a static endpoint that has a predefined query that gets run on the server side and returns you a predefined object, right? So even though right now we're still in the console, the query I'm about to write is the same query that you would write whether you're building a React application, a Vue application, an iOS app, or any type of client-side application. The way that it works is you make a post request using this query, and then the API is able to handle the rest. So what does that look like in practice? So here what I'm going to say is, okay, I want to write a query, and I want to build the main page of my call it my blog application or my publication app, right? So I want to see a list of my posts. So I'm going to say I want the post list query. I want to know how many posts I have. For every post that I do have, I want the ID, the title, and the status of the post. I run that query, and boom, that's the data I'm getting back. What's really important to know about this is that these queries are dynamic queries, right? So for example, I only said I wanted the ID, the title, and the status, so that's what I got. So if I wanted to, the next time I could say, well, I also want the cover image, right? And cover image is actually a relationship to a files table. So I go into that relationship, and here I say, okay, I want the download URL of the file. So now when I rerun it, now I'm getting that download URL that I can use in my application to display the image. And once again, with these relationships built into my data model, I can do these queries relationally rather than having to hit different endpoints for different types of resources. So for example, let's say I wanted to know the author of this post. I could open up the author. I could say I want their email address, their first name, and their last name. And then I also wanted to go from the author to the publications that they work on. So I go into the publications. An author can belong to many publications. So I'm going to go into each one of those and say I want the name of the publication, and I want to know how many posts are in that publication. Cool. I run that query, and boom, right? What's really beautiful about this is just how simple that interface is for the API, to where the response I'm getting is super clean. It's one API call. And frankly, I could build out my entire screen getting all the data from it from that one API call, which is super powerful. And once again, all this was auto-generated for you by 8base based on the data model that you provided. You didn't have to go and build out a custom model view or serializer to enable this type of endpoint. Now, inside of these operations, they're really feature rich, right? We won't be able to cover everything in this demo, but I'll just give you a quick example. So for example, if I opened up the argument area up here, I would be able to specify different arguments I can pass in that will affect my query. Things like if I want to do pagination, if I want to do sorting, if I want to do grouping and aggregation, if I want to do filtering, those are all there in the API just ready for you to use. So a good example of this would be, let's say I wanted to apply a filter to where I only wanted posts that had a title that contained, contains 10. Let's just say the string 10, right? So I do that, I run that post, or I run that request, and suddenly it's filtering my data, right? Now, these go a lot deeper for, you can do this on any type of field type, and they all have different predicates based on the field type. You can do compound filters. Like I said, it goes really deep, and I have a lot of great educational content on our documentation, which is docs.8base.com, as well as on YouTube, where we have a whole suite of videos, over 4 hours of educational content to help you get started and really kind of dive into how all these features work and what's possible. Now, there's a bunch of different operations generated for you. For example, when it comes to queries, which are read operations, you have the post list operation, or the list operation for any table, as well as then just if you're querying a single record, like post, you can identify that by the ID or any unique and mandatory field. However, if we go into our documentation explorer here, which is really cool because a great feature of GraphQL is that it is self-documenting. So whenever we do changes, the documentation actually auto-generates and self-updates. So for example, we deleted the example table, so we won't see it here. But if I went into my mutations, which are my write operations, and I looked up for my posts, what I can see here is that I can create a post, I can create many at one time, I can delete them or destroy them, which is essentially a hard or soft delete. I can delete or destroy by filter, which means I can delete or destroy many at once that match a certain filter I pass to it. I can restore deleted posts, I can update posts, and I can also update by filter. Updating by filter is actually really cool because it uses atomic operations. So for example, let's say I wanted to query a list of different records that all had a different date timestamp on them. Instead of having to update each of those individually, let's say I wanted to add 10 days, I could just say add 10 days to each of their individual values rather than set one value for all of them. But I could do it either way, obviously, because there's also a set operation. So once again, really feature rich. Now, between the queries and mutations, we're giving you multiple options to perform any create, read, update, or delete operation, right? However, we also give you subscriptions, which are really great. What subscriptions are is essentially if I wanted to subscribe to any create, update, or delete event on the post table, I could. And that could be either a subset of posts that I'm subscribing to, a single one, or when any new one, or when any record in that table has one of those events triggered. Now, what that means is that from a client-side application, I would then receive real-time notifications or event alerts with the data being passed back that I asked for. So where does that get used? Well, we can build messaging applications that are real-time interactive. We can build notification feeds. You can build a stock ticker app that's updating the stock prices in real time, rather than having to either poll for data changes or have your users refresh their page to get new information populated. So those are WebSocket connections over AWS Lambda that enable that feature functionality, and they work really well. So once again, I'm just going to jump over here, see no questions so far. Okay, we are cruising in that case. So this is a huge step forward, right? Just from the standpoint of we have a data model, it auto-generates this entire API for us, to which already we could start building a front-end application, getting data in and out of our system. However, the next really important question that pops up is, okay, well, how do I make sure that only the right people, right, are able to do the things I want them to do? You know, for example, I don't want anyone to be able to update a post. I don't want anyone to be able to delete an article or a post in my database. So how do we approach the problem of roles and permissions in 8-base? Now, if we go here to our app services area, we can click on roles, right? And then our roles are going to pop up. Now, roles are pretty straightforward, right? From a standpoint of you give it a name, you give it a description, and it's just kind of like a placeholder for the most part. However, if I jump into my author role, which I've created, what I can see here is that I see all the tables in my database, and then I see all these options for creating, reading, updating, deleting, as well as field level that I can specify different permissions on. So for example, in the example of the author, if you're an author, we want you to be able to create posts, right? So for this role, we say that you can create, checked. Now for reading posts, which post do we want you as an author to be able to read? Well, you should be able to read posts that have been published, right? That would make sense. But you should also only be able to read, you should also be able to read the posts that you currently have that are in draft stage. So what we're able to do is apply a custom filter here, which is essentially saying, hey, if the post was created by you, or if the post status equals published, then you can read it via the API. And what's great about this is that this is always enforced whenever an author or a user that's authenticated and it has the author role is hitting the API. So they'll never see another author's unpublished post, even if they literally wrote a query that said, hey, I want to see those ones, the API would reject that. And these filters that you can apply are completely relationally driven. So for example, if I wanted to only let authors read posts that are part of publications to which they are a contributor, we could write that exact same filter and have that enforced. So super flexible tool that actually, when we are building multi-tenant systems or SaaS applications in 8-base, we rely heavily on this, and it really has enabled us to build amazing solutions for our partners and customers. Oh, we got a question. 1 second. You may cover this later about third-party integrations, but as a developer, if I wanted to build an application with 8-base that then integrated with another software like QuickBooks, HubSpot, Acme Co custom third-party, got it. How would we go about that? If I wanted to do a custom integration to Acme Co, but keep the access key secrets, how would that work? Greg, we will get into that. So don't worry, it's coming up in about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, maybe even sooner. But thank you for asking it. So once again, that is specifically for which posts can I read, but I can apply that for updating and deleting. For example, here I'm saying that, well, an author can only update the post that they've created, and we just kind of alias it for you by saying the user's records. But under the hood, that's creating a filter that's saying if it was created by a user whose ID is equal to the logged in user. And once again, this drives down to field level access. So for example, if I went to custom access on the fields, maybe a user has access to reading that record, right? Based on that operation that they're performing, but we can just protect certain fields on that table if we wanted to. Maybe for whatever reason, I wouldn't know why, you never wanted the author to see when their post was created. So you could just say there's no access, and no matter the permissions, they can never get that field value back. Or it's a read-only value field to where they can never update it. So a lot of different options in there of how you can configure your roles and permissions for your application users, and make sure that you have a very secure system or very secure API, so that you don't have to worry necessarily about your front-end developer potentially messing up, running a query, or not specifying a scope in a query that would get them data that they shouldn't be able to see. Now, roles can also extend to developer roles. So for example, let's say that I was managing a team of developers and I wanted to give someone a role to access the backend to potentially do some work. I could generate that role and then say whether or not that user can manage our schema, they can access the viewer, they can deploy custom functions, which is, we'll answer Greg's question once we jump into it, team administration, workspace administration, all these different things, as well as then the custom functions that we do deploy on the GraphQL API, whether or not they can invoke those specifically. So what's also great about this is that on the developer role, for example, if I say, oh, here, they can only see certain records, that's also going to be enforced when I go into my data viewer, right? So if you give someone access, you can give them scoped access as a developer to only certain data, only certain data, as well as different system areas. Now, once we get past roles, what we have to think about is authentication. And kind of like I mentioned earlier in the webinar, authentication in 8-base, we are not an authentication provider, right? So we are not storing usernames and passwords. We rely on authentication providers that are OpenID compliant. Now, that could be if you're used to working with Okta, Auth0, Cognito, any of those types of services, you could bring the 8-base and use that to authenticate your users. And all we rely on is a valid JSON web token that we can verify based on the public verify endpoint that is specified in the OpenID specification. However, we do help in a way if you just want to get authentication stuff in your app really quickly. We have something called 8-base authentication, which under the hood is AWS Cognito. So that's where we're using there. However, let's say you're going to bring Auth0, you can specify your credentials here that Auth0 provides you when you create a new application, or if you're using an OpenID provider, you can give the OpenID provider URL, and that will allow us to know that based on the bearer token that's being passed to the API as the authentication credential, where we go verify that and that was intended to be used with your workspace. Once you link those things up, you have some simple options here about saying, hey, are users able to self-sign up for this application? Can only people with certain email addresses sign up for this application? Can anyone sign up for this application? As well as for when a user signs up, whether or what roles they are granted by default, right? So maybe when someone signs up, we're going to give them the author role automatically, and then immediately they can start using the API as an author should be able to. Once you create one of these authentication profiles, though, it's giving you all the client information that you need to initialize an Auth SDK inside your application, depending on the type of application that you're building, as well as the ability to white label any callback URLs that you might need to do if you're doing a hosted login redirect. One thing that I always like to mention here that's really important, though, is let's say that you see here that when someone signs up, you assign them their roles. What if you want to change those roles over time? Now, anything that we do in the 8-base backend is actually available on our API, which is really cool. So 8-base is a completely API-driven system. That means that if I wanted to create a new table, I don't necessarily have to go into my data builder. If I wanted to, I could write a mutation called table create. Wait, where is it? Oh, maybe I think, oh yeah, system. I go into my system API, table create, and then I can pass the data that I need to use to create a table, add fields, generate a new workspace, and then of course, create roles, assign roles, switch roles around. It's all available there. So hypothetically, if you did not like how 8-base looked or how our console worked, you could go build your own and still use our API to build your own workspace. I think it would be a big effort, but it's possible. So this just really highlights the flexibility of the system when adopting it as your backend architecture or your backend for your application. Now, one thing that's really cool too, this is an integration that is an 8-base native integration that I'd like to demonstrate. So this isn't specific to the integration question that Greg had. However, 8-base is soon to roll out a plugin infrastructure that will allow developers to author plugins, bring them into 8-base, share them. It's going to be a really cool value add to our community. However, for one of the first integration that we decided to build was one with Salesforce, which is a really cool and powerful example of how you can utilize data stored in a third-party system like Salesforce, but use it to build custom applications with an 8-base backend. So if I want to add an integration, I can go here and click on Salesforce. It's going to say, what do you want it to be, your API name, some simple options. So I can go ahead and create that integration. Once created, I can now connect, and I can either connect to a Salesforce Sandbox account or real account. My real account is my sandbox account. So I'll just go from there. So I click connect, it's going to bring me over to Salesforce. I was already authenticated, I think, so it just asked me to log into Salesforce and then redirect me back to the Api backend. However, what it's doing right now is it's actually importing my Salesforce schema, not my data. So it's only bringing in the schema. And so it says, yep, Salesforce is now ready. Let's start adding tables. So if I go back to my data viewer now, I have this new area called Salesforce. And just by default, it brought in my account field, my account table, my contact table, my lead, my opportunity table. There are hundreds of tables in a Salesforce database, and I could go through and import any of these. For example, if I want to import my goals table, I click on goal, takes a second, and it imports that schema. And so, for example, when I look at my account table here, I can see all the fields that are stored in Salesforce, right? Or all the data that gets stored in Salesforce. And if I go to my data viewer, it's actually bringing in the data from the Salesforce API and displaying it for me here inside my Api console. Now, where this gets really cool is that we can cross-connect schemas, right? So for example, let's say that this was a big publication company. We use Salesforce for our CRM. However, we had this custom CMS application that is built on Api, to which a publication belongs to an account in our Salesforce data, right? So that's the tie between the two. What I could do is I could go to my Salesforce schema. I could drag and drop my publications table over here. Whoa, 1 second. Oh, we're getting a little bit of a lag. Sorry about that. So I drag and drop my Salesforce publication right over here, and it's gonna be in 3, 2, 1, hop in there, hopefully, cool. Sorry about that, the animation I guess was bad. At which point I can configure that relationship like any other table. So for example, I'm just gonna say that a account has multiple publications, right? So an account on our Salesforce can have multiple publications in Api. And I'm gonna go ahead and say that an account, a publication has an account. So that makes more sense. So I create that field, or I create that relationship, excuse me. Now that relationship's been created. So I go to my publications, and I'm just gonna look at the publication data. I have 2 publications, nature and food. So let's just say I wanna go into my nature publication and now say that it belongs to an account called Edge Communication, right? There we go. Create, update that record. And now here's the cool part. So I'm gonna go to that was my nature publication. Yep, I'm gonna take the ID of my nature publication. I'm gonna go here and now I'm gonna author a query that is looking for my publication that has the ID of that. And now for that publication, I wanna know its name. I wanna know when it was last updated, but I also wanna know the account it belongs to, and I wanna know the name of that account, as well as what else do we got here? Created date, right? I run that query, and what's really great is that brought in my Api database, or the Api data, that brought in my Salesforce data, and it gave it back to me in one response. You know, and so what you can imagine going forward, as we roll out more of these integrations or more of these plugins as they will become, you'll be able to make queries, mutations, all against different systems and have that all be synced together through one really convenient developer interface. Cool. So now if I jump into my settings, there's just some more general stuff that's just call it because we have a platform, we have it, right? You know, so for example, some team administration type tools, billing interfaces and whatnot. API tokens are essentially the ability to create static tokens that have a role associated with them. So for example, this is a static token I generated, which I use for a CI/CD, a CLI authentication, right? So I add it as a secret to my GitHub account so that when my CI/CD runs, it has a token that it can actually send functions and deploy functions to my Api backend. I've also seen people use API tokens in a more sophisticated way to where they use them as the authentication credential for like IoT devices. There's a lot of really great ways that you can play with those and then utilize those in the roles and permissions engine to make sure that a device has the appropriate roles and access rather than an authenticated user. So more flexibility. However, now to get more to what Greg was alluding to, what we've really seen here is that there's a significant amount of a project that gets accomplished through using the API's backend in this capacity, right? Let's say it's the 80% of just, I need to create, read, update, delete records, and I subscribe to them. I need to configure roles and permissions based on my domain. However, there's going to be a lot of custom server-side logic that I need to write that we've not kind of seen any exposure to. And really, when it came to that, we thought we want to give people the most flexibility in how they want to approach that really custom piece of the applications that they are developing. So what we decided to do was essentially allow developers to author JavaScript or TypeScript functions and deploy those to the backend as 4 different function types. And so now we're actually going to jump over to our code, to my IDE, my code editor. And one second, I'm going to switch the screens that I'm displaying. So we're going to, one second, let me switch that up. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing really quickly and reshare here. Cool. All right. Everyone should be seeing my IDE at this point. Now, here we are in VS Code. Of course, you could use any type of IDE or code editor that you want. And what we're going to do is we're going to initialize a new server-side function directory that we can author functions in and deploy them to an 8-base backend. Now, we have the 8-base command line tool. You can just run npm install 8-base CLI and then use the command line tool. However, if I run 8-base init, let's just call this CMS functions. I can run that, and then I'm just going to say that I want my syntax to be JavaScript rather than TypeScript. I find it more convenient to work with. I'm going to run that. And then what's it going to do is it's going to ask me which workspace do I want to connect to, or do I want to deploy these to? So I'm going to say my CMS backend workspace. And then it went ahead and generated a function, a directory with some example functions in it that we can reference to explain the different function types. So CMS demo, bring those into my workspace here, and great. So the main configuration file in this is the 8-base YAML file. This is very similar to like a serverless framework. It's not using serverless framework. It's just we adopted a lot of the design patterns from it. Now there's 4 function types that you get to author to essentially enable any type of functionality in your backend application that you want to have. The first one is a resolver function. So the resolver function essentially allows you to add operations to your GraphQL API. So the same way that we had a post operation and a post list operation and these different mutations and all those things, you can author any of those that you want to where essentially you define an input, you define an output, or you type an input, you type an output, and anything that happens in between is your custom code. We also have task functions, which is essentially your ability to encapsulate logic or JavaScript inside a function that's reusable across other functions. So maybe you have some type of task that multiple functions would have to invoke. You put it all there so you can follow more of a dry principle in your coding practice rather than have to duplicate code across multiple functions that you would have to do otherwise. Now, tasks are also great because you can put them on schedules. So for example, if I wanted to write a scheduled task that runs at a rate of every 5 days, I could do that, and that function would invoke once every 5 days. This is a simplified format of specifying that, which supports, I believe, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks. However, if you want to, you can author any type of cron declaration for the cadence at which that function runs using cron syntax. We just felt like this is a nice convenience because cron can get a little bit confusing at times. So let's just delete that. We also have webhooks. So webhooks are essentially your ability to stand up a RESTful or an endpoint on top of your GraphQL API. So you could say, hey, I want a webhook that runs at /send grid callback, right? And then it accepts a post request, a GET request, patch, delete, whatever it might be. And essentially that allows you to have third-party systems send data back to 8-base, receive that in your function, handle it however you want to, and return a success or invalid response, whatever, however you want that function to behave. And then finally, we have triggers. Triggers are hugely valuable. It's essentially your ability to say, I want either before or after a table, let's say posts, has a record created, updated, or deleted. And so a good example of that is maybe after a new post is created, the author that authored it has a lot of subscribers and you want to send an email to all their subscribers that a post has been created. Well, in here, that's where you'd be able to specify that point in the life cycle and write some custom code that allows you to perform that. Now, if I wanted to, I'm just going to say this. It's very easy to generate new functions. You don't have to go in and create files. In the command line tool, we have 8-base G, which is generate. You can write out generate if you wanted to. And so, for example, let's say I wanted a new task function called my new task. I'm just going to say it's JavaScript instead of TypeScript. I could go ahead, run that. It's going to generate the, oh, one second, I need to move into my project. So CMS functions, cool. Now I'm in the directory and I can rerun that. And so when I run that, it adds the declaration in here for me automatically. And it also added it to my task functions directory here to where I have all my tasks, right? However, what do these look like? So let's say I wanted to jump into my before post create trigger. So I go into here and this one is called trigger, even though it could have any name. It's just the example function. And in here, essentially what I'm able to see is that I have a JavaScript function in here, right? That I can just delete some of the documentation to pretty it up, that I can write any type of custom code in here that I want. Also, these projects, you're able to install any NPM package that you want. So you have access to the entire NPM ecosystem. So in that example of sending out an email, maybe I'm using Twilio or SendGrid, right, to send out emails. I could install the SendGrid SDK in this project. I could then import it. Let's just write some pseudocode here from SendGrid SDK. I can import it into this file. I could then say SendGrid. Let's say that this is a new instance. So I'm going to use a constructor. So a new SendGrid instance to which I could initialize this SDK, SG, and have that there. Now, also to Greg's question, which he had asked, if I have a secure, if I have a sensitive key, how do I make sure that that's safe? In the base backend, there's an area called environment variables. You can input a key value pair in there, and those are protected and secured. And then you have access to those by running process env my key name, right? So for example, this would securely initialize our SendGrid SDK, to which then we could say, okay, well, SG send email and pass in any data that we need to that function, as well as await its response if we need to, and have that execute and then return any data that we want from that trigger or any other function type that we are dealing with. So what's also great about these two is that, for example, let's say that we wanted this, let's say that we're sending a lot of emails from a lot of different functions. We wouldn't want to go through that process every time. This is essentially a shared directory, right? So you could say, hey, I want to have a directory called shared, in which I'm going to have my twilio.js file in here. Let me just copy that. In here, I could build a custom module if I wanted to that allows me to do anything that I want that custom module to do. I could then export that. Let's say just export default. Cool. Here, that wouldn't work, obviously, but we could do that. And then I could import in multiple functions that module that I added to my own project, right? So if you want to kind of do utility type modules or whatever it is, you're able to do that and have that as a shared resource in your backend project. Finally, what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm just going to delete this code, and I'm going to pretend that this file has some brilliant, extremely useful code in it that is exactly what we want it to do. However, what we can see is that all it's doing is returning the data passed to it right now. Now, but what I'm going to demonstrate is that we have the ability to invoke these functions locally, so you can do local testing on them before you deploy them to your production environment. If I go into the mocks folder, which every function directory has, I can see there's a request.json file. to which this is passing in essentially the stubbed object, which is going to mock the event argument being passed to my function. So what I'm able to do, like you can see that I have data foo bar in here. So if I go back to my function here, I can see that there's some in-code documentation that allows me to write, let me just clear that up, 8-base invoke local, the name of the function, which is trigger in this case, and then the name of the request, where the mock, which is request. I could have 10 files in my mock that passed in different arguments and whatnot to test out different scenarios for that function. But here we're just using the default request one. So if I run that, it's going to go ahead and invoke that function. I can see that I'm getting the data back that I passed. What is available in these, which is extremely useful, is, for example, if I wanted to hit my API from one of these functions, I could say context API GraphQL request. I could then add my mutation query, whatever it is in there. I can then pass in any variables that I need to pass to that, as well as if I wanted to, I could bypass my roles and permissions. So check permissions. False. The reason you would do that is because you're in a server-side environment here, so you know it's safe. So if you don't want this call to affect, maybe it's a task, like a scheduled task or something, if you don't want any roles to be considered, you can bypass those by passing in that option. So we covered a lot. I'm going to really quickly go back and look at whether or not we have any new questions. Hopefully, I'm going to say that that question was answered. And Sword, cool. So hopefully there's some new questions at this point. The last thing I'm going to talk about really quickly is how do you handle like migrations, like different environments and whatnot? Because right now, if we were to run 8-base deploy, it would deploy it right against our master environment. And that's that. Same with any changes that we made during our development, right? So adding that table is suddenly live. Changing a relationship is suddenly live. Essentially, what 8-base enables for workspaces on premium plans is the ability to have CI/CD native to your workspace. So for example, if I run 8-base environment list, here we can see that for this workspace, I only have one environment set up, which is my master environment, right? However, from that master environment, I could branch staging, development, different feature branches, and then that creates an implicit chain of the path that I need to push migrations through, right? So if I am developing against my development branch and I make a bunch of changes, I then need to graduate those to staging before I can graduate them to master. Every one of those environments has its own endpoint, so you can pair it up with a different front end and test out those environments, whether it's with user testing or with it's a QA team, however you want to structure that part of your organization or that part of your project, so that you can really safely deploy code and push it through. And then in each of those stages, specify whether or not you want to migrate data, whether you only want to migrate schema, so on and so forth, all the different options that you might have. However, it creates a really, really kind of like, there's a good convention in place that allows you to very safely create applications, make changes over time, and migrate those changes up to the production environment. So I'm going to stop screen sharing at this point. And hopefully we covered a ton of things. Hopefully you guys saw a lot of value in some of those things, but I'd love to open it up to questions. We can dive into certain things a little bit deeper if you'd like to, but my time is yours. Cool, Greg, I'm glad that answered your question. Thank you. No further questions, cool. Great, thanks for joining. Thanks, Mauricio, appreciate that. All right. Well, so appreciate all the positive responses. I really, that's great. Oh, can we get a recording? Yes. Yes, we can, Stephen. So this whole session's been recorded. I'm going to clip either end of it a little bit and then put it, make a public link on YouTube, essentially, that I'll make sure to send out to the attendees list. And you're more than welcome to share with customers, colleagues, whoever you want to distribute it to. Cool. Thanks, David. All right. All right. So I'll hang out for another 2 minutes in case any questions pop up. And if not, I think that will be at that point a wrap. So for everyone still there, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the questions that did pop up. And we'll be doing this monthly. And if you have any, for example, last month we didn't kind of dive into the Salesforce integration, but based on some feedback, people wanted us to explore that today. So if there's anything that you in your 8-base journey want to kind of get highlighted, feel free to shoot me an email at sebastian.scholl@8base.com. I think you will have my email address too, just from sign up for this webinar. To which I'm more than happy to try to include it, change the subject that we're going over, use a different example to really make it an engaging session for you. So please.